It's also a question of really building these collaborations between the users and the producers of knowledge, so that that no longer, in a sense, is a distinction between user and producer. We are all producers of knowledge in different ways. We're all holders of important knowledge in our own domains. We need to use that and share it among us in an effective way. And one thing I wanted to mention, this was triggered a little bit by Professor Hopkins' talk, 5 years ago, at the 20th anniversary of the Brundtland report on our common future, that we were asked to write a kind of a 20-year response for the UN, which was presented at the UN in 2007, 20th anniversary. And somewhere in the process of the small group of us that wrote that report, someone came up with this name, this sort of phrase, a kinship of interdependence. And I like that very much, because it emphasizes the idea that we have to learn how to understand the relationship to one another among even those who are, if you will, invisible to us. So who made this stuff? Who assembled this? Where did it come from? I'm using it. It's important to me, but I have not a clue who I'm dependent on to have created that. And we no longer have communities that we live in that are biologically bound like tribes. So in a sense, intellectually, through education, one of the goals in my mind, one way to think about it, is how do we develop this capacity to be aware of in our learning process of our relationship to the people who are responsible for keeping us in whatever condition we are in, of living this way. And one problem then is that this is not just sort of an academic nice idea. This is urgent and it's critical. It's vital. We cannot survive without developing this. One way to think about it, one side of it, if you will, is this planetary boundaries, and I won't take the time to go through them. But this is a very important idea, but as I've argued with a number of the people who wrote this, it's the real issue is it's the humans who are coupling these systems. They aren't just happening by themselves. So we need to think a great deal about how we change behavior. Again, what has been stressed in the first two talks. Keynotes. So why can't we do this? Well, again, I don't have time to go through the whole list, but the point is there are many barriers, many kinds of barriers, if you will, or I hope they're not barriers, they're obstacles and issues we have to deal with. And in that, we need to think about how all of these pieces affect us. And it's not, again, only about learning and cognition. It's about emotions. It's about affect. It's about ethics. It's about perception. And it's also about legal systems. One quick note, which was brought up that Professor Clark just mentioned, we often have, people have talked about a precautionary principle, but there's also something known as a preventative principle, which comes into play in a legal sense when in fact the responsibility for actions crosses boundaries, or may cross boundaries. And then the question is, who's liable for the damages of that? And by saying that, well, that's just something that drifted across to you, but I didn't intend that, we need to have the legal structure that says something about fundamental responsibility in preventing this kind of behavior, not cleaning it up afterwards, if at all. So all of these are issues that come to the question of knowledge, learning, and societal change. And so what I'm really asking in this project it's a 10-year, it's not a project, it's a whole alliance of people working together all over the world. And I certainly hope, and I'm very excited about the possibility that we can collaborate with many of you here in Taiwan in addressing these issues together, and in coordinating not only in terms of Taiwan, but with all the other projects, so that we learn from each other, from individual situations, comparisons with those. So let me tell you a little bit about it, because I think it's a good framework for these questions. The point really is, we want to understand and enable both, not just understanding, but we want action. So enabling is in there as well. The use of the mechanisms and levers of both behavioral and societal change, that is individual and collective changes, that can lead us to a more sustainable effort. And we want to do that truly as a collaborative, as a transdisciplinary and collaborative effort among researchers, practitioners, stakeholders at every level. And we need to do that across both, if you will, time boundaries and spatial boundaries. So we need that integration. One way to show that, and I got into a little trouble with this in an interesting way, because I stole this from, it's a well-known NASA diagram, but in the NASA diagram, this is a little box over here on the side. I want it in the middle, because all of that's coupled by us collectively. It's not an act, it's not that here's the natural system and we kind of sit by and watch it go by and use it. We're in the middle of that. And that's what we need to understand and to pay attention to. Another way to say the same thing, to look at the same thing, is if you think of the global systems on the outside, this work, yeah. Sort of the frame is this global systems. The key piece is this coupling between humanity and the ecosystem in which we are embedded at every level. And no, the ecosystem isn't that forest over there somewhere. It's here, all around us, all the time. And then within that framework, then to look at the interplay and influence, mutual influences between knowledge, learning, and change. It's not a one-way street. Sometimes something happens, like a hurricane, like a landslide, like a revolution, and change happens. And then we try to learn from it. It can be in any order. The question is, what's the relationship between it, and how do we get to learning from it, not just experiencing it. So the kinds of questions I'm interested in and we are interested in the context of knowledge, learning, societal change, are linking that also to governance of the commons. How leadership, again mentioned earlier, and vision and the narratives and identity affect the capacity and the commitment. Capacity is not enough. Commitment to change. And what are the key factors in the nature and the dynamics of change across levels of society, and also across different dimensions, if you will, of aggregation, of small communities, small environments, to much larger domains. And Eleanor Ostrom's work on this kind of governance of the commons, she has stressed very strongly this idea of polycentricity, that it tends to be in small, well-defined communities. Yes, but we also need to understand why those boundaries exist and how do we transcend them or reproduce them in more important ways. And what's particularly relevant in the educational framework then, what are the roles and capacities capacities of both formal and non-formal education and institutions in facilitating these kinds of transformations. Now, I don't have time to go a lot in this, but I think, again, Professor Hopkins referred also to the informal sector, the lifelong learning, and that is indeed critical. One of the comments that I would make, and again, don't have time to go into, is that it really has to start from preschool. From the very earliest levels, it has to involve parents, because they're primary influence, but also the school environment, the teachers, the administration, from early childhood through lifelong learning. University is a very important part of that, not only sort of the university, no university is an island unto itself. We don't just sort of go in the university, rattle around, and get spit out. That we should be connected with the higher education facilities throughout that entire trajectory. And part of what I'm interested in is how do we develop a coherent trajectory of learning in life. Very briefly, we've been really trying to build a community of people, but from all kinds of domains and resources, from dancers, anthropologists, physicists, engineers, you name it. Because we have different ways of thinking about the knowledge, about the learning, and about the kind of changes we need to make. So everybody's invited. Methodologies, just very briefly, and again, there's not time to go into this, but I think the point that I want to make with this slide from one of my colleagues is just that there are many different approaches to getting at the kinds of understanding of the levers and mechanisms of individual and collective change. So it's not one approach or surveys or whatever. There are many approaches that give us some insight, and we need those as an accumulative effort to gain the kinds of insights we need. Very briefly, it also relates to the environmental governance and so social change, cultures of practice, cultures of communities of practice and learning, and capacity building for change and transformation. Very, very useful just to mention one of the projects that has already launched under Knowledge, Learning, Societal Change is based in Japan. In fact, I'm supposed to give a keynote there on Monday, and unfortunately my teleportation booth is not yet quite finished, so I'm going to have to do it remotely, I'm afraid, because I will be, which I'm very glad about, I will be in Taiwan. So unless somebody happens to have a small teleportation booth I could borrow, anybody? No? Oh,
we have stock it.
Yeah?
We have stock it.
Oh, okay, good. This project is a very interesting one, and I think is a nice illustration. It's really looking at creation and sustainable governance of new commons through the formation of integrated local environmental knowledge. And Professor Sato at the Research Institute for Humanity and Nature, this is a funded 5-year program funded by the Japanese government. We had started from the beginning of doing this as a collaboration under Knowledge, Learning, Societal Change. And it already has several nodes, parts of it, and it will, I think, give us some very interesting insight into the relationship, not only of this sort of local environmental knowledge, but the integration of that, the mutual learning between the local knowledge, the traditional knowledge, and if you will, formal global scientific knowledge on a mutual basis that helps us look for solutions in that context. They may not work in the next community, but they may work there, and the next community has to do the same. Another example that has not started yet, that will probably start early next year, is with Professor Hele Lotsisipka in South Africa, and doing sort of a meta-analysis of, particularly of narratives and emotions, affect, I'll talk a little bit more about this issue of narratives and models tomorrow in our brief exchange there. Let me quickly then touch, to finish up, on issue of models and learning. In this, models are really essential in making a sense of complex issues. Humankind, and boy, I think I'm much more limited than that, but in principle, we can handle about 6 or 7 variables in short-term memory at any moment. I'm lucky if I can handle 2. But that doesn't help us if we're talking about 1,000 or 10,000 variables. We can't do it. We must have models. Problem is that if you then talk about models and you talk to stakeholders, very often they don't understand what you mean. Yet every one of us, from early childhood, use models. They're very simple models, but they're the same kind of idea, just that we make much more elaborate ones, which we do need to understand, because if we think about the options that we have for acting, the models provide insights into those options. They don't provide answers. They just give us a better set of ideas that we could work with. And when I talk with politicians on Capitol Hill or in the European Parliament and so forth, I very often get the response, no, I don't want to hear about the models, just tell me the answer. And my reaction is, sorry, that's the answer. That's as far as we get. Those are the options. So we need to think about how we communicate that, because otherwise, if you use the model for a question which the model was not designed, or for a model which has no data that's valid for what it's being looked at, it's meaningless, it's pointless. And yet that happens frequently. And very importantly, that means that the stakeholders must understand how models can be used appropriately for decision making. So we need to develop a coherent educational strategy that addresses this through computational modeling in particular, and I don't have time to explain why, but through that and multidisciplinary project-based learning, use of games and simulations to get us to that point. I will, since my time apparently is up, I will skip the ending of this. Let me just quickly go through for let's see if it'll do this quickly. One other thing which I will talk about tomorrow is the fact that how do we tell these stories? We tell the stories with the narratives. And the narratives are a very critical part of this issue of engaging people broadly. And again, for lack of time, I won't go into it, but it is a key piece of it. So the models are the cognitive and, if you will, the way that we analytically think about the problems, but the narratives are the way we remember and communicate that. So let me, that's the end of the presentation, but more importantly, that's just the first few steps towards a sustainable future, I hope. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jeffy. As a rule of thumb, any questions? No? May I ask one question, just to hit it up? I like the framework you mentioned about learning, knowledge, and societal change, and you also mentioned that order is not important, the relationship is crucial. I agree. But what if we want to start with one point? Where do we start? From individual or societal change? Or should we wait for everybody changed and then the society can change? Or should we say government change first? How?
That's a really important question. I think it really comes back to what both previous speakers brought up, which is I think that it's very much an issue of top-down and bottom-up, because you need both policy and you need political will. You cannot do it from one side or the other, I believe. I think probably the public broader understanding is a key. And I think it has to do more, again, with not simply the knowledge, but the understanding and the capacity to use that knowledge.
So we should generate the pressures and with solid knowledge to pressure the government to change. Right? Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.